I wasn't planning on becoming anything at first. There were a lot of things I knew I didn't want to do, and really what happened was that list got longer and longer and longer. I didn't want to do what my parents did. I didn't want to do what my uncles and aunts did. I didn't want to do what my friends' parents did. I wanted to not have a job. And in a funny way, I mean, it sounds like it's sort of like unromantic explanation for why one would become a writer, but in a certain way that is why I became a writer, because it allows for this freedom to not, there's very, very little constraints, either in terms of having a boss or workplace, but also just imaginatively. One of the things I thought I might want to be is a doctor. So now if I want to be a doctor, I go hang out with doctors. I put my, mind into the, hopefully, mind of a doctor, and I'm a doctor for a certain period of time. It's not quite the same thing as like reaching up into somebody, but it's probably better than going to med school. Well, right now, in part because I am a writer, and as you get older, like the inertia of your life begins to become sort of overwhelming. And I also right now because I guess I'm more curious about what it can do for me. Like the experience of writing is much, much deeper now than it was in the beginning. In the beginning, writing was fun. It was entertaining, both for me as I wrote, and my hope was that it would be entertaining for others. And it felt I felt alive when I did it. But it's become a much deeper experience in the sense of having to confront what it is I actually care about and what I actually think about. I am surprised much, much more often now when I write than I was before. Before it was a kind of fulfillment of ideas or plans or hopes, and now I approach projects having really no idea where they're going to go and being open to where they want to go. I almost have to ask what you mean by the last two books. You mean Eating Animals?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Eating Animals was like, I might as well have, played for like a minor league baseball team. It was so unlike my other books. And I agree with you that this book is really different, and maybe even different in a way that Eating Animals was like the beginning of the trajectory of, having to do with examinations. My first two books were about these big gestures, like big visuals and big voices. Eating Animals and Here I Am are much like, they're focused and they're looking at something very closely. Eating Animals, it's explicit what it's looking at, the problem of factory farming. With this book, it's a little harder to describe, but it has something to do with domestic relationships and identity and notions of home. This book, it's much more into the details of living, in the same way that maybe Eating Animals got into the details of this certain way of eating and raising animals. No, it wasn't even a novel. I mean, so this novel was the result of all kinds of eclectic work. I spent about 2 years working on a TV show for HBO, which didn't end up happening, and I took some material from that, really just like the idea of it's hardly like specific to that show, but an affair that's revealed on a cell phone. And that became one of the crises in this book. That's like the domestic crisis. The global crisis was an earthquake in the Middle East, which came from an entirely different place in my life, that I also didn't necessarily think was going to be a book, but just a curiosity that I had when I was living in Tel Aviv, and I ended up going to the Geophysical Institute and spending a day with the guy who runs earthquake preparedness over there. I have no idea why, because it was interesting to me, What else is one going to do in Israel? And so my writing is the process of a lot of events like that. Like I think about something in this context, I see something over here, and over time, a lot of these things come together. A lot of them don't. On my computer, I have on my desktop, I have two folders, or files. One is called Castoffs, and one is called Novel. Novel is what you'd think it is. Castoffs is just the stuff that I thought was going to be in the novel that didn't make its way in. It's not like mental crap. It's just stuff that didn't quite make it in. And that Castoffs folder from the first day I started working on the novel until I turned it in, was always larger. And by the time I turned it in, it was quite a bit larger, maybe twice as large as the novel, because it's just an inefficient process, the way that I do things, just sort of culling stuff, hoping it might stick, and inevitably a lot of it doesn't. But that process allows, using that process, the stuff that doesn't stick sticks in an interesting way. You know, it's not like someone who opens up a puzzle and puts the pieces together. It's sort of like picking just like crap up from the sidewalk or from like your glove compartment or some stranger's desk and finding out how that stuff fits together into a puzzle. There's a chance that some pages in it will. Yeah, yeah. I often do that actually when I'm starting on a next project. I'll go back and look at cast-offs. But what gets kind of weird is when the natures of the projects are so different, but the cast-offs still apply. Like, you know, when I was working on this, I would sometimes look at the cast-offs from Eating Animals, even though they couldn't possibly be more different. But because I know there's like a continuation of a sensibility. You know, for me, it's not about trying to write a better book. I don't really believe in that verticality of books, but like a book that along a horizontal captures where I am in a given moment, like my concerns and hopes and my imagination. And so even when I'm writing on a very different subject or writing nonfiction rather than fiction, the sensibility still presides. And so some of that may have something to do with whatever the next project is. It just depends what you mean by autobiographical. You know, in the sense of events in the book corresponding to events in my life, no. In the sense of feeling the book very personally, like a personal expression, yes. It's not cathartic or therapeutic. I wasn't working through stuff, but, and I don't feel any closer to Jacob, the hero, than I do heroes of my other books, or even like Jacob's wife or son or other characters in this book. But somehow the sum of the voices or the atmosphere that's created or the culture of the book, you know how each book kind of has its own culture, felt very personal to me, felt closer to me than anything else I've written. I don't know if it's, let me put it this way, Dwight Garner, when he reviewed the book in the Times,
I just read it.
and I loved that review, even though he was critical about certain things, he was funny when he was critical, and he was probably even right when he was critical, but the last little bit, he said something about like there's more life teeming in this book than hundreds of other books put together. I know that that's the quality I most value in books, is like the quality of teeming with life and the sort of fullness of life and an irrepressibility of life. I like books that just confront you and will not be said no to. You know, not that they're presenting an argument, that's not what I mean, but that they almost like, you know, there's a part in this book actually when I refer to Jacob as remembering seeing E.T. when he was a kid, and the bike chase scene, and these kids with this fucking alien on the thing, and they're coming, there's cops behind him, there's a cop in front of him. And I remember the feeling, everybody in the theater, I saw it 3 nights in a row, 3 nights in the first week, excuse me, at the Uptown. Everybody in the theater watched, whether you're 8 years old or 80 years old, watched that bike chase scene like this, because it was just like too much, too good, like, irrepressible. And the idea of writing a book that almost had to be read like that, because it was just like the force of the life behind it was so much that it verged on being intolerable or unbearable. Those are my favorite books to read, and those are the kinds of books that I would want to write. No, I haven't, and so there's a passage where the hero is urinating next to Steven Spielberg. I haven't heard from him. I assume he's a man of good humor and like would appreciate it. Never do I say he's like, I never actually make fun of him at all. Although I do draw a lot of attention to his penis.
Yeah.
But isn't that what people want in life?
They're not gonna hear. Are they gonna hear me laughing in the background? Yeah, I'm laughing too loud. Sorry.
So the title "Here I Am" refers to. It's funny. I was watching Transparent, an HBO product, the other night, episode 4 of season 3, and they had a big "Here I Am" moment, where the characters talk about that reference in Genesis, and someone singing it. Someone said, "Here I am, here I am." It was chilling, actually. In any case, it refers to a scene in Genesis, the binding of Isaac. So that passage begins, and then God put Abraham to the test. He said, "Abraham." Abraham said, "Here I am." God said, "I need you to sacrifice your beloved son." So the sort of obvious interpretation of the test is it's the sacrifice, but it could also be simply how would Abraham respond? God calls him, and Abraham says, not, "Give me 5 minutes," not like, "Let me fold the laundry," not like, "Who is it?" But "Here I am," unconditionally, without reservations. And then a couple sentences later in the story, when Abraham is leading Isaac up Mount Moriah for the sacrifice, Isaac begins to sense that something weird is going on. They have all the makings without the sacrifice itself. And he says, "My father," and Abraham says, "Here I am." And the problem is you can't be unconditionally present for God who wants you to kill your son while being unconditionally present for your son who doesn't want to be killed. And that paradox of identity was something that I tried to play out in this very contemporary setting, where these characters believe or have been sort of present in paradoxical ways, like both inside of a marriage and outside of a marriage at the same time, both wholly devoted to their children, but also devoted to their careers and their lives as individuals, or devoted to kind of religious values and devoted to secular values. And the two crises of the book, this discovered cell phone and the earthquake in Israel, compel choices. Like, you can no longer be in both of these places at once. You have to choose an identity at the expense of the other. Like, you can be in this marriage and choose it, but it means then you cannot have these other things that you want. Or you can be out of the marriage, but then you are not going to be in it. You can go to Israel to fight. The earthquake precipitates a war that becomes so bad that the prime minister asks all Jews between the ages of 15 and 55 to go to Israel to fight. So Jacob can go and fight, but then he has to relinquish certain maybe liberal American values, or he can maintain those values, or just maintain the life that he's comfortable with in America, but he has to then admit that Israel is ultimately dispensable for him, that his life will go on even if this country is destroyed. So the "Here I Am" is the "Here I Am" of sort of where do people stake their ultimate identities.